remember the first few set of interviews in my first equipment setup was a little microphone on a tripod, and I would put it between me and the guest and ask them to sit as close as possible to me without it being super uncomfortable, just so we could get the best audio quality coming through. And I did that for about a year, and I should have been a lot more embarrassed about the setup that I had than I was at the time, but I literally didn't even know any better. Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the Startup Playbook Podcast. As some of you may know, this week we celebrated 5 years since the podcast first launched, and it's been an absolutely crazy journey. But for this episode, we thought that we might do something a little bit different. And again, for those of you that have followed the podcast for a little while, you would know that I'm much more comfortable asking questions than being on the other side and answering them. Again, as I mentioned, we wanted to do something a little bit different. And for this episode, we thought that we'd lift the curtain a little bit on the podcast and the process and answer some questions that people have had over the last few years of the show. And thank you to all of you that have also submitted questions over social media as well. This week, I'm going to hand the mic over to Tyler Lockwood, who has been helping me with the podcast over the last few months. She's got a great podcast as well called the Unlock Earth Podcast. We'll be asking some questions with the guests, and hopefully I'll do my best to answer them as much as possible. So Tyler, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Rohit, for letting me take the reins. I feel very privileged to be here, and it's been a pleasure working with you. And yeah, I'm just really excited to be starting this journey with you, especially coming up to 5-year mark. It's a great time to celebrate. So I guess to begin, it would be really great to know kind of what you were doing before the podcast and how you kind of came up to the point where you started it.
Yeah, so I've mentioned it a couple of times on the podcast, but it depends how far back you wanted to take the journey, but I studied engineering and economics at uni and kind of knew pretty quickly it wasn't what I wanted to do. I moved to Sydney and kind of fell into the startup scene there and went to a lot of startup weekend competitions and those sorts of things. And just kind of felt like I found my people, found like a lot of people that had very sort of similar views and just people that were really excited about sort of building something from scratch and especially focus on startups and growth. So ended up launching a startup called Stage Label that I was running for about 3 years or so. It was a crowdfunding for fashion platform to help brands to market test their garments pre-production and also to help reduce waste from dead stock that they hopefully wouldn't need to stock again. Incredible journey, didn't pan out the way that I had sort of wanted, but off the back of that, I knew that this was the space that I wanted to be in. And kind of one thing led to another, and the podcast sort of launched off the back of that.
Wow, that is an incredible journey. And I mean, I personally really relate to that first startup that you started, being in the space of sustainability. So it's great to kind of see where that journey started for you. We actually have a listener question to start off, following up from that question, and that is from Sean Greenhalgh, and he is from Time Chi. And his question today is, what made you want to start a podcast where podcasts weren't really the in thing to do?
Yeah, so I mean, now it seems like almost everyone's got a podcast these days. But back 5 years ago, podcasts were really sort of new, especially in Australia. And I think I'd listened to a grand total of 3 podcast interviews before I decided to launch my own one, which, for anyone that knows me is probably about right. And so what made me want to start it? Well, there were a couple of reasons. So one was I mentioned my first company, Stage Label, and off the back of that, I was just fortunate to have a lot of startups that were sort of reaching out to me for help and guidance and mentorship. And obviously I knew that I had my own experience, but I just felt like there were other people that could provide more relevant experience and guidance for a lot of these founders. So, I just wanted to help kind of connect the dots. The second part of this was, at that time as well, it was a little bit, we're kind of coming and seeing the evolution of the startup ecosystem. But back then it was really at the start of people getting interested in startups. And I also noticed that there were a lot of people coming in to try and give advice to first-time founders. And a lot of this advice is coming from people with a corporate background that hadn't necessarily run their own startup themselves. And based on my own experience, it wasn't things that I necessarily agreed with. So I wanted to create a platform where, people who had been there and done it before could talk through their own experiences and their process, knowing that not everything will be relevant, but at least you're hearing from someone that's been there and done it before, and you can kind of take the bits and pieces that sort of make sense for you. And the third part was, really selfishly, I wanted an excuse to just speak to some really smart, interesting people. I've always been very sort of introverted and shy growing up. So I wanted to, just get better at communicating and just create a platform to do that. And what better way to force yourself to get better at something than to do it publicly in front of a bunch of people?
Absolutely. And I think that many of us podcasters would agree that just having cool conversations with people has got to be one of the best parts of it. And obviously being able to provide value really helps as well. Was there a point kind of during that journey, especially when you first started, or even if it was a little bit down the line, where you saw the potential for the show to be something that you were going to pursue long term? And I mean, you're at 5 years now and who knows how many more to go, but was there a particular moment where you thought, oh, wow, this is something that's something I'm going to really invest in and do long term? I
was very lucky, partly because of the timing, that there weren't as many great podcasts as there are now, especially within Australian context and especially within the sort of startup space as well. And so the podcast took off very quickly. I think it hit number 3 on iTunes a couple of days after launching, which just provided a whole heap of validation for me. At the start, I wasn't expecting anyone to listen to the show at all. I literally just wanted recordings that whenever I was meeting someone one-on-one, that I could just point them in that particular direction and hopefully provide a more scalable way to do that. And so it was very surprising that people actually enjoyed it and listened back to the interviews and sort of got something out of it too. So that was one. I think it is really important to have that sort of feedback loop as well. I think, especially for something like podcasts where you are recording something and sort of putting something out in black space and you see the download numbers, but you don't really know whether anyone's really listening to it or not. I think one of the other things that for me personally just kind of showed the power of that was when we did a live podcast interview with Nick Crocker. I just remember people sort of flying in from Brisbane and Sydney for that particular event, largely to meet with Nick, but also it was just very surprising to me that all of these people that I'd never met with before had listened to the show and were willing to sort of make the, pre-COVID sort of travel over to Melbourne to see this event as well. And so just being able to see that and just kind of the wonderful messages that people have been sort of sending through over the last few years as well has just been really helpful. But I think it's also become the one thing that I've known that, I don't know specifically when this happened, but it was quite early on that I knew that I wanted to do long term. So my whole plan was I always wanted to do this over a 10-year period. Just more than anything else, I just wanted to see what happens if you stick to something for a 10-year period and what's the sort of end result of that. So still feel like I'm 5 years in, halfway, but still feel like I'm at the very start of the whole process.
That's incredible. And I mean, I hope there's another 5 years and maybe even 5 more after that. It'll be really interesting to see sort of the way this podcasting and startup space really continues to grow and develop in that time, because I think it's really something that it is always growing. Like you said, when you first started, there were a few great podcasts. And now, as you said, it kind of seems like everyone started one, me included. And so it's great to kind of see how that's unfolded for you. And again, hearing that story about having people all over the country come together for an event that really is kind of like your baby is just such an incredible experience and seems a bit surreal in COVID times, but incredible to hear that sort of journey that got you there. What has kind of changed and what has stayed the same, I guess, since the podcast first started? Because there's got to be a lot changing, and I would love to kind of be able to reflect on this in even 10 years time and look back and see what even has changed for 5 years. But let's start with the first 5 years. So what's stayed the same and what's changed since then?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot that has changed, but maybe I'll start with things that have stayed the same. So as I mentioned, one of the big things for me that was really important was to bring in people on the show that were experienced operators that could talk about things from a position of here's what I've done and here are my lessons, rather than things that are theoretical. And so I think that's always been really important for me as a marker for the show, because I think that's where people will learn from the most and where I think a lot of the advice is the most meaningful as well. But there have been a lot of things that have changed. I remember thinking back to the first setup that I had. I mean, we just had some audio issues of kind of doing this online, but I remember the first few set of interviews in my first equipment setup was a little microphone on a tripod, and I would put it between me and the guest and ask them to sit as close as possible to me without it being super uncomfortable, just so we could get the best audio quality coming through. And I did that for about a year, and I should have been a lot more embarrassed about the setup that I had than I was at the time, but I literally didn't even know any better. So, obviously the equipment setup and things like that now. And I think part of that is also been because of, so many more podcasts that are launching as well. There's a lot more kind of investment in that space. Other things that have changed are, my process of actually going about and doing the interviews as well. So naively, one of the things that I sort of really prided myself on over the first few years of the podcast was almost going in with no prep and doing the interviews on the fly. It forced me to get a lot better at listening and kind of creating much better conversations on the fly. But it also meant that there was a lot that I kind of overlooked. And so now there's a lot more work that goes into research and prep for each interview, which I think makes the interviews a little bit better as well. And what else has changed? I mean, the other things that I think have always sort of stayed the same is kind of the structure of the podcast as well. So I think that, depending on the type of show that you're doing or, the type of setup, you can have a wide variety of guests and you can keep the type of questioning the same. Because what's actually really interesting there is the differences in the answers between the same set of questions. But when you're kind of have a very niche podcast like mine is around startup founders and investors, it can get very boring to ask the same questions over and over again. So one of the things that I've always tried to do is try and tailor each episode to be specific to that particular guest. So what is something interesting and unique about that particular guest that we can hopefully try and tease out and make that episode stand on its own, but also make it really useful for both the guest and for the listeners as well.
There is so much to unpack there. You kind of, it's incredible to see how much can change and how much does stay the same. And I'm very much of the opinion that having great content is always key. So having really good guests, and as you said, even the way that you prepare to talk to those guests has changed over time. I'd love to hear, because something that you do that's, I think, quite unique from my experience listening to podcasts is that you will talk to, if you can, some of the people that are close to or around the guests. So maybe it's their co-founder or their first investor or their first employee, just a couple of people that are close to the guest and kind of can report back on that story. How did that start for you?
Yeah, so this was just a forcing function for me to, try and get better as try and improve the quality of the podcast, to be honest. Especially after I took a 9-month break and I sort of came back a little bit more sort of recharged and really had to think about how do I just become better as a podcaster and how do I make this experience both for the guest and for the listeners much better than it was. And, one of the things that, as I mentioned, I'm very fortunate that a lot of the people that I have on the podcast are well-known in the ecosystem and they do a lot of other interviews. And again, it's kind of one of the personal KPIs that I have for each episode is how do I make this interview really unique or different or really special for them. And although there's a lot of things that you can learn from listening to past interviews, which I've also sort of incorporated into my research process, one of the best things and favorite parts of my process now is, as you mentioned, speaking to a couple of people close to the guest. And so you can find some really interesting insights and anecdotes. It's also interesting hearing perspectives from people that are really close to the guest as well around things that they maybe overlook or don't really realize that they do. But, just sort of interesting components in terms of how they operate, how they sort of make particular decisions, things that they've done that they may have potentially forgotten about. And I think it just also, shows a real interest in the guest as well in terms of kind of being able to do the work and make things really sort of hopefully special and unique for them as well when they take the time to come on the show.
Absolutely. And you often hear when you say to the guest something that their friend, coworker, investor, as I said before, has said about them, like you'll say their superpower is, and they get really happy and excited. It's really nice to have that sort of exchange with them. I actually want to link to a listener question now, and that is from Steve Rukas from Catalyst Business Consulting Group. And you touched a little bit on process there, but Steve's question in particular was, what do you most enjoy about the process?
Yeah, so I was actually just going to mention one of the things that I almost wish that I could record, but I think it works better as it not being recorded, is actually those conversations with people as part of the research process, because people say the most like wonderful things about each of the guests, especially when you kind of ask questions about their superpower or things that they've done to help them. It's just absolutely amazing and just makes me feel really great about interviewing those particular people on the show as well. And I generally try and share bits and pieces with them both before and after the interview. But again, like one of the things that I've also really enjoyed, especially getting to do these interviews in person, is just the conversation with each of these guests, both before and after the conversation too. Part of me, again, wishes that we could sort of record those conversations, but just being able to have the guests sort of opening up, it's just been a really wonderful way to kind of helped me personally build relationships with them, but also know that, I guess hopefully it's been a really great experience for them in terms of doing the interview and just getting to know them a little bit better more than anything else.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the most asked questions from our listeners was about your guests in general. So clearly you have some incredible ones. So I'm going to go to another listener question, and something that came again from Steve, but also Bryce Chi, who is the support manager at Mr. Yum, was how do you go about securing such great guests, and how do you really find the guests for the show? So that was something that a few people kind of sent through and wanted to know, how do you just find and secure such incredible guests?
This is a question that I get all the time in general as well. And, honestly, like it has changed a lot. I remember at the start, a lot of it was just going out to people that I already knew, trying to build up that momentum. A lot of the kind of after the first wave, the next set of guests really came from referrals. So again, because I was trying to have such a positive experience for the guest, I was hoping that they would, recommend particular friends or coworkers or people that they knew in their network that they thought might also make great guests on the show. Over time though, like the podcast has gotten to a point where, I still do a lot of outbound. Malcolm Turnbull, for example, was just a cold email that I sent through and he somehow said yes to that. But again, just I guess the podcast, and this has been one of the interesting things that sort of happened over the 5 years, is just the compounding effect of it is, there's a lot more inbound that comes in for the podcast each week. So I usually get about 30 to 40 inbound requests to kind of feature on the show. And it's just more about sort of filtering through that process. So it's a combination, but absolutely at the start, it is such a grind. And, more often than not, people are going to say no. But one of the biggest lessons for me from this podcast and from talking to other people as well has been genuinely, like, if you don't ask, the answer is always going to be no, but you just need one person to say yes. And, the more that you kind of do put yourself out there and put yourself in a situation where people are just more likely to say yes, just off the back of one yes, you can get, 10, 20 other great guests as well. So I don't think that there's like a one size kind of fits all, and it's definitely an evolution over time, but it's always a combination of, me just reaching out cold to people on social media or through email. Also just a lot of kind of thankfully being in a position to have a lot of sort of inbound as well. I don't know. It's just somehow worked so far.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that about it's really always a no unless you ask. And that is something I've definitely had a very similar experience with. So if someone is listening and wants to start a podcast, that has to be like the best thing for getting good guests, is all you have to do is ask. And I mean, the worst they can say is no. So that's, such a great angle to take. And obviously you've had so many incredible guests, but we have an interesting question from Dustin Elliott, who is from the Better Questions, Better Life podcast. And Dustin asks, who is your white whale of podcast guests?
White whale is in like the person that I want to get on the most?
I think so. I think that's what it means.
So I guess one of the real sort of inspirations to me when I first started the podcast, just from a content perspective, was a guy named Gary Vaynerchuk, Gary V, who's kind of all over social media. I think in some way he would have been across everyone's newsfeed at some point. Him and Tim Ferriss were two of the people that two podcast episodes that I had sort of listened to at that time. And, my goal was always to try and get people of their caliber on the show. And that actually helped me have a really strong sort of filter in terms of the type of guests that I had on as well, because I always thought about it from the perspective of if I would, reach out to Gary V and ask him to come on the podcast, he would obviously want to have a look at my sort of the guests that I have on and work out whether it would be worthwhile for him to come on the show or not, which has always become a great sort of filtering mechanism for me. And I came very close to interviewing him. So I actually had an interview scheduled with him in person in Melbourne. And I was in Canberra at that time and flew back. And unfortunately, he had some issues with flights and had to sort of cancel all of his afternoon appointments, which is a real shame. But I did get to meet him that evening. And it was an amazing experience. So hopefully I'll get him on the podcast at some stage. He'd probably be sort of the number one guest at the moment, I think.
Absolutely. And hopefully this will be his call out to try and get him on the show.
Yes, make sure you tag him on social media. So
now this is a question I really want to know is, was there any guest that you went to the absolute lengths of the world to get on the show? Like, what was a guest that maybe you scheduled with them and your schedules kept conflicting? Obviously you said about Gary V then, but was there someone that you really went really long and hard to get on the show?
I mean, Gary V is probably the one that I've kind of wanted from the start and sort of came close to getting. So that's probably the closest. And there are other people in the ecosystem that I have been trying to convince for a really long time to come on the show, and it's been a slow burn. There's one person in particular who just keeps sending me referral guests because he just refuses to be on the show. But someone like Adam Milgram, for example, I've known him for a really long time, and finally convinced him to do his first ever podcast episode with me, which was great. And it was, we had a great sort of conversation and things like that as well. And I think, one of my favorite things about the podcast in general is just being able to give a platform to amazing people in the ecosystem who are doing great work that, maybe don't get the sort of exposure or the normal sort of press or kind of the kudos for everything that they do. And just being able to bring them onto the podcast and help them sort of talk about their story and their perspectives and all of those sort of things is awesome. So there are still a couple of people that I probably won't name names on this, and I'm trying to get on the show and to convince them to come on. Yeah, it's just it's like there are a lot of great people on the show, and many people that I've had to sort of call in favors to try and get them on.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've had so many incredible guests, so I don't blame you for having to fight long and hard to get everyone on the show, because they all turned out really, really well. Now, there was a really interesting question that came through from Jessie Wu, who is community at Afterwork Ventures. And I really like this question. So this is a fantasy football, but startup edition. If you would have found a startup and could have anyone who you've interviewed on your early team and cap table, who would it be and why?
This is such a tough question. I love fantasy football as well, especially Fantasy Premier League. For anyone that I think I'll be putting a call out on social media for the league as well. So if anyone that plays, please come and join the league. It'll be a lot of fun. Yeah, this is a really, really tough question, because I've I think one of the really interesting things about the ecosystem has just been seeing how many great VC funds have launched in the ecosystem as well. To answer the question, I think it would depend on the type of startup that I was running. Like, I think there are a lot of great funds that have different focus areas that, depending on what I wanted to do, I would, go to particular funds. There have also been people that have made a ton of time for me and helped me with my career, or just kind of taken phone calls from me. People like Alistair Coleman, Adam Milgram, who I mentioned, Will Richardson, Paul Naftali. But if I had to pick one person, this is purely because, I think she's absolutely amazing. And I've mentioned she's one of my favorite people in the ecosystem. And we've also had the pleasure of working together. And it was just an amazing sort of 7 months that I had sort of learning from her. But Rachel Newman at now Flying Fox Ventures, absolutely great investor, great person. And she'd probably be the first person that I would pick up the phone to.
For some reason, I just knew you were going to say that. And it's that, I think that again has been such a great thing about the show, is just being able to build relationships with all these people. And I think that, as well as what's been interesting about the show, as you mentioned at the beginning, you ask each guest, sometimes it's similar questions, sometimes it's different questions, but at the same time, no matter what area they're in, they're going to have a different perspective. And that is what I think really brings that value. Another listener question that I would love to touch on, because I feel like it kind of links in with that last one, is from Max Korsman, who is an investor at Tidal Ventures. And his question was, how do you see the podcast intersecting with your other work in the ecosystem?
I mean, I think the great thing about the ecosystem is, and just people in the ecosystem, is like, everyone has so many different touch points with things, and everything is kind of interconnected in general. I've never sort of thought about the podcast as being something completely separate, but as something that sort of ties into everything that I do. We kind of speak about this a little bit at AWS, but talking about the flywheel effect. And for me, the podcast is kind of front and center of that, and just being such an important lever in my life in terms of kind of opening doors, building relationships, learning and growth, all of those sort of things that I just think that it kind of fits in perfectly with everything that I sort of do, and hopefully want to do in the future as well.
So clearly it's been something that has really impacted you and other people. Obviously, we have so many great listener questions. I want to say thank you again to all the listeners who sent a question. But I would love to know sort of what, if you had to narrow it down, because I know you could probably write a list of about 1,000 of these, what have been your 3 biggest lessons from your guests on the show? There's
been so much, and honestly, like it's hard to keep track of all of the conversations over the last sort of 5 years as well. I think there are particular things that do stick out to me though. In terms of functional things, like I think one of the big themes that's come off the podcast is just the challenge and the importance of hiring the right people and having the right team around you. And I think this has come up in sort of several conversations, but from recency bias, I think the conversation with James Chin Moody from Sendle, one of the things that he really spoke about is when he looks to hire, he looks at it from a framework of either it's a hell yes or it's no. There's no in between. And it's definitely a lesson that I wish that I had taken on board a little bit earlier through my previous businesses as well, in terms of just being very clear and deliberate with the type of people that you hire, and also just setting an extremely high bar for that. So I think that's a lesson that I kind of really take away. I think for me, the other things that I've really sort of taken away, probably less functional, but more hearing from people's story and journeys, and just understanding that even though from the exterior that people might have these wildly successful businesses, that there's still all of these struggles and things that they go through, which kind of really humanizes them. So I'm thinking about someone like Cal Henderson from Slack, who he and his co-founder, Stuart Butterfield, launched a video game, failed that, that company didn't quite work out. And they sort of pivoted that into launching Flickr, which they sold for like $30 million. They then went back to try and launch another video game or the same video game, thinking that they'd learned all of those lessons and now knew what it took to build a successful company. Unfortunately, they failed again and then ended up building Slack, which I think sold for something like $30 billion last year as well. So it was really interesting kind of talking to him and, really kind of understanding yourself and understanding where your sort of real strengths lie, and knowing that just because you kind of fail in one particular domain doesn't mean that, it won't sort of translate into something else, has been really interesting. And one of the interviews that I think really hit home for me, and something that I usually always talk about whenever I talk about the podcast, is my conversation with Justin Dry, which is episode number 3. So right at the very beginning, but him kind of talking about going through, 4 years and 4 different pivots of the business. When I had interviewed him, they'd just raised $25 million in funding, but prior to that, he had mentioned that his sister was also sort of married to his co-founder at that time. And his sister would come to him and say, will we have enough money for Christmas presents this year? And for me, it was just so startling to hear from someone who, again, from the outside looking in, just had this hugely engaged community, this business that was sort of wildly successful, kind of talking about some of the real challenges that you wouldn't expect. And it just kind of really sort of hit home about the struggle that sort of everyone goes through from a founder perspective. And then, sorry, I'm like more than 3, but Kate Morris from Adore Beauty as well, and just kind of hearing her story about starting the business with, I think it was something like $12,000, and just having 2 small brands, and just the amount of time that it took for her to build some credibility and get industry buy-in as well for Adore Beauty at that time, which, again, has turned into an incredible business and doing so well as well. So yeah, I think for me, there are, obviously practical lessons and takeaways, but, something that really sort of connects for me is just understanding human stories. And so I think just hearing from the other side of things that you potentially don't get to hear about as much through press or through other channels has just been really amazing for me personally, and things that I've really taken away from the show.
Yeah, as I said, you probably could, I'm sure, list hundreds and hundreds of lessons that you've taken away. And because every guest, I mean, you've had so many already over the last 5 years, every guest gives you a number of lessons. So honestly, good job on nailing it down to those few. And I'm sure you could go into much more detail into lots of them. But a few things that you kind of touched on there was about really being honest and transparent about the journey, and really being okay with the fact that just because everything looks like it's going well, like a lot of startups do, behind the scenes, there's a lot of hard work and a lot of dedication that goes into it. So I do want to segue into a listener question here. And this is from Arjan Agarwal. And he has a podcast called Arj Speaks. And his question is, what kept you going? I mean, I'm sure you had really difficult times in that. So what kept you going through those times? Yeah, I mean,
like with anything, I think that it's really interesting, because I think at the start you have all of this motivation and all of these dreams of kind of what things are going to be like. And, you launch, and the first few weeks, it seems really great. And then at a certain point, a lot of that goes away. And it does become a grind, and all of the things that you thought were kind of manageable just become so hard to kind of keep yourself going through that process. And I definitely went through that multiple times with the podcast. I remember, getting about 28 episodes into the show and going, I think I've run out of people to interview. Like, I don't know how many, like, who else am I going to find, and who else is going to say yes to coming onto the show? And, I kind of touched on this again, like I took a 9-month break as well, which for me was a really big, it was like just a really big kind of stepping back point where I was just burnt out. I was at a stage with the podcast where I felt like instead of really enjoying the process and really enjoying doing the interviews each week, it just became a chore that I had to do and something that I felt like I had to do on behalf of other people versus something that I kind of really enjoyed. And so that plus like exiting out of my last business, like it was just a lot of kind of different things happening. And I'm really glad that I took that time again to sort of recharge and bring it back, because I felt like it's just the podcast has gone to another level since I took that break. Yeah. So like, I mean, there's been a lot of things that, I think make things really hard. I think one of the things that was again highlighted in a recent interview with Alistair Coleman as well is just really understanding yourself. And I think one of the things that I really understood about myself was that I'm much more accountable to other people than I am to myself. And so setting up particular environments or habits that forced me to do this on behalf of other people rather than doing it for me really helped me kind of stick through those periods when I really didn't want to do it. So I think I've mentioned this in a few blog posts before. One of the things that I used to end, and I think I still end each episode with, is, I'll see you again next week. And I remember speaking to a few friends about this, but I was like, I don't ever want to go to a startup event and have someone call me out and say, hey, we were expecting an episode and like you didn't deliver. And I know it's so weird and like no one would ever actually do that, but it was kind of that external motivation that kind of forced me to push through those times when I didn't really feel like doing it. One of the other things that has kind of really helped me as well is just taking screenshots of people when they send nice messages about the show or providing feedback. I've got a little folder on my phone, and I don't think I ever look at it, but just knowing that it's there in the background and knowing that there are people that gain some value. As I mentioned with something like a podcast, it's really tough to get feedback because you're literally just recording an episode, you're putting it out there. You get some level of interaction on social media, and then you kind of just going through that same process again, but you never really know whether anyone's listening, whether anyone's getting any real value from it, which I think makes the whole process of like, is this even worth me continuing on, even more challenging. But yeah, just kind of receiving those messages have just been really powerful. So, and it's been really helpful for me. And so like, I would encourage anyone, like if there are podcasts that you listen to or content creators that you follow or people that you just, tune into every now and then, please try and send a message to them, because I think, although it might be a small gesture for you, like I think it can mean a lot for those content creators to keep doing what they're doing and hopefully sort of providing value. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. I think that is a great way to do things, and kind of remaining in that positive space is always really important. I would love to know, what is the best piece of feedback that you got from a listener?
Best piece of feedback.
Or maybe feedback that came at a time where you really, really needed it and you were kind of like, oh, I don't really want to do it anymore. And then you got something and you went, okay, no, it is worth it.
Yeah. So, I mean, best pieces of feedback are like just, it doesn't need to be much, but like even just founders saying, like, thank you for the episodes, because like this is part of my process that I go through when I'm raising my next round. Like I listen to the interviews with investors that I'm going to have meetings with, and like helps me prepare. Again, just knowing that something that I did randomly a few months ago has been helpful for people is always nice. I think the thing that was probably the most, on a personal level, the most meaningful for me was after I mentioned the 9-month break. Honestly, part of coming back was I was a little bit worried whether anyone would care, whether anyone would sort of listen to the show, whether people had sort of completely forgotten about it, and whether I would need to start from scratch again. And just seeing messages from people saying, that they were so happy that the podcast was back, and all of those sort of things were just validation for me that like it was nice that people did remember the show from all of those sort of months ago, and that me sort of deciding to take a break because it was what was right for me didn't necessarily have a negative impact. And if anything, it's been, as I mentioned, a really big positive for the long-term goal. So yeah, it just really helped reframe a lot of things for me, of just knowing that it's not because it's a weekly show and, I'm setting this expectation, but really helping me kind of think about, if I really want to do this over 10 years, what's the best way to do that? And if I need to take breaks in between, all of those sort of things to get to that 10-year mark, it's okay. And, people will be understanding, and people will still get value from it.
Absolutely. And it must have been very scary to kind of take that 9-month break, focus on yourself, and then come back and hope there are still people there. And obviously there has been, and that's been really great. And you've had some incredible guests since then. And I mean, throughout the whole journey, I'm sure you've had lots of highs and lots of lows. So I want to kind of do two ends of the spectrum. So these both come from listener questions. So firstly, again, from Steve, have you had, and if you have, what was your most embarrassing moment behind the scenes?
Embarrassing moment. I mean, I've touched on one of them already, which was just thinking back to the awkwardness of putting this little tripod between me and the guest and just asking them to come and sit close to me to record the interview was always a fun experience and very embarrassing. But the second one was I remember very early on doing an interview with Paul Naftali, and we just had a great conversation around everything. And I remember just going home and listening back to it and just realizing that there was no recording at all of the interview. Yeah, which is a terrible, terrible thing. And at that time, again, like I was just used to sort of pumping out interviews weekly. And so we had to kind of, I had to, like, it was just I felt horrible about sort of messaging him about that and saying that, you know, the interview recording didn't take place. And I thought that I hadn't pressed play, but it turns out that my microphone was out of batteries and all of those sort of things. And the new battery that I had placed in didn't work, and it just kind of turned off after 2.5 minutes or something. But yeah, it's, you know, as it's a podcaster's worst nightmare, as Tyler, you probably know from your own show as well, of just going through an entire recording and then realizing that there's actually nothing there. Yeah, that's tough and not a fun thing that you want to have to go back to someone to say, hey, can we just try and do that again, please? Yeah.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say that's a podcaster's worst nightmare. And I mean, even beyond that is the worst nightmare of if you had a guest that you just knew you couldn't get back. So if you had a Gary V, you sit down and recorded it and there was no recording. So It's great. And most guests are so understanding and welcoming and open. So that's what makes it all easy to handle when stuff like that happens. So thank you to all the guests out there who have gone back and re-recorded with a podcaster because it didn't record properly. I think coming from every podcaster, we appreciate it. Absolutely.
I mean, I should add, Paul was absolutely like super understanding and very lovely about the whole thing. And we recorded another conversation, which I think was even better than what we sort of first recorded. So thanks, Paul.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Well, to kind of counteract that, I have another question from Bryce, which was, what was the most fulfilling moment on your journey?
Oh, I think there's like so many different angles that I could sort of take this from a podcast perspective. Again, like I've kind of spoken about some of the real sort of positive experiences and just like the really lovely things that listeners of the show have done to make this whole process really worthwhile. I think one of the things personally that has been that was really good about COVID last year was doing these interviews online. For my parents, and especially my mum, it's been really difficult for my mum especially to grasp what exactly a podcast is. She kind of knew that I was doing this thing for a really long time, but she never really knew. And she somehow very proudly worked out how to use Zoom to join the sessions. And it was really, you know, I think one of the nicest kind of bits has been seeing her sort of turn up to a lot of the live podcast interviews and just kind of tune in and then send me really hilarious messages after the interview as well. But yeah, I guess just kind of seeing, I guess, having my family better understand what it is that I do and all those sort of things have, again, on a personal level, just been really sort of fulfilling. I think from a podcast itself perspective, you know, obviously getting someone like Malcolm Turnbull on the show was just a really big sort of moment for the show, where I think it provided a lot of credibility, even though the podcast had been running for about 3.5 years at that time. A lot of credibility for the show, especially for people that maybe weren't as familiar with the show or just weren't as interested in startups as well. And I remember the day before that interview, I was fully expecting the whole Gary Vee situation to happen again. And the whole week, I didn't tell anyone that the interview was taking place or anything. You know, I was half expecting the interview to be canned. And I remember getting an email from his PA the day before. And I saw the email coming through and I'm like, they're going to cancel the night before the interview. And she's like, oh no, he's really excited about the interview. Just wanted to make sure that you had everything you needed and everything. And I was like, very relieved, but at the same time, very stressed that this interview was actually going to take place as well. So yeah, like from a podcast perspective and kind of growth perspective, like that's been really big. But yeah, as I mentioned, just seeing kind of how things have compounded, having my sort of family better understand what it is that I actually do every week has just been really meaningful for me.
Absolutely. And I mean, if this compares at all, I put all my podcast episodes on a CD to give to my grandmother so she understood what a podcast was. So it is one of those things that there is maybe a mild generational gap, but it's beautiful to see that your mum worked out how to get on those and join in, especially during COVID, when I think being around family and having that connection was more important than ever. So it's so nice to hear that story. On this kind of topic of really memorable moments in the show, was there a particular moment where you kind of realized the power and the impact that the show has? Was that having Malcolm Turnbull on and really having that credibility, or was there just another random moment where you went, wow, this show is really having an impact on the community?
That's a good question. I mean, from a show perspective, like I remember after the Malcolm Turnbull interview, obviously there was a really big spike in kind of inbound interest. I mean, even the Cal Henderson interview from Slack, who is someone that I never would have thought that I would have been able to get, came in as an inbound request of like, would you like to have Cal on the show? And I was like, absolutely. How do we schedule this in as soon as possible? So yeah, I think it was just kind of one of those, like that particular interview was just a catalyst for a lot of different things. But I think in general, it was that as a moment was, we spoke a little bit earlier in terms of being able to go out and just ask people, and the answer is always going to be no unless if you ask, but you only need one yes. I've reached out to countless people over social media, over cold email, and all of those sort of things. And a lot of people have said no or never responded. But, again, like as I mentioned, the Malcolm Turnbull interview, I literally just cold emailed him and he replied the next day. And I think off the back of that, it just helped spur on a lot of different things. And I think personally, it gave me a lot of confidence to just go out and reach out to other guests that I potentially have wanted to get on the show, but like have held myself back from kind of doing those sort of things as well. So I think it was just a reminder of just being able to sort of push yourself a little bit further than you think that you're sort of capable of. Again, it's obviously great to have Malcolm on the interview, but I think it was just everything that sort of moment represented for me that was probably the most powerful thing.
And like you said, you have so many incredible guests, and it's more of like a validation when someone like Malcolm comes on as like all of these episodes have made such an impact on it. I guess from that point of view, I've got, I think, one more listener question to ask you, and that comes from Steve and Bryce. Again, thank you guys for all of your questions. Had kind of a similar one. So what's sort of your preparation ritual or the process before you go to interview someone for the podcast?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this has changed a lot, but the process that I follow now is usually if I don't, and this is just completely lifting the curtain on the podcast process, but if I don't know the guest beforehand, or we haven't sort of previously had a relationship, one of the things that I will make sure that I do is just hop on a call with them, just to make sure that we're, first of all, on the same page. So one of the key requirements that I have about someone coming on the podcast is it's not a sales process. Like we're literally there to kind of talk about the journey and hopefully share some practical insights and lessons that listeners of the show are able to take away and sort of apply to their own business. So first of all, making sure that we're on the same page about that. Secondly, just kind of talking to them about, what are, as I mentioned, trying to tailor each interview to each person. So what I'm trying to gauge is, are there particular elements of this person's journey, things that they're really sort of experts on, or things that have been really unique about the type of business that they're running that would be interesting perspective that hasn't really been shared on the show before. And, a lot of the time, the guests are really willing to kind of talk about what some of those things are that they want to dive a little bit deeper on as well. I think one of the best things about podcasts is that unlike other mediums, like let's say traditional PR, where they don't really get to control the narrative, and a lot of it is, especially in the startup space around fundraising, around kind of growth, a podcast is really an opportunity for someone to come on and share the full context around everything and kind of really talk about things from their perspective. And so really just making sure that, again, we're structuring everything in the right way that sort of allows them to kind of bring their best, because I think that will sort of help bring the best possible podcast interview out as well. And then, as I mentioned, one of the other things that I'll do is listen back to all podcast interviews, look at some of the sort of previous blog posts or things like that they've written, speak to a couple of people close to the guest to kind of pick up some insights and anecdotes. But again, for me, even though I have gone through all of this process, so sometimes I'll have 7 to 8 pages of notes for a particular interview, I'll generally only have sort of 4 or 5 talking points that I'll go into an interview with as well. So it's kind of the combination of, I have all of these things in the background, but I still want the conversation to be really natural and it not be sort of structured around following a particular formula, because, more often than not, I think the best parts come from when you let someone just go. Someone who's really smart and has an opportunity to kind of talk about things that they maybe haven't had a chance to talk about before, and just being able to sort of explore different positions and themes. So I think about my job more as how do I structure this in a way that makes sense and, hopefully is a good listening experience for the people. But really a lot of the content comes from the, amazing and smart people that I have on the show, and just making sure that I'm just giving them a platform to talk about things that they want to talk about.
Absolutely. And I think that that's so valuable. Like we've said a dozen times, the guests have been so incredible. So understanding that sort of pre-game ritual maybe for the show is really, really valuable, because that's how you get the best out of them. So thank you for sharing that. Now, on my show, I have a section which I call Quickfire questions. So I want to ask you a few quickfire questions. And the first one is about you personally. I would love to know, what are some of the hobbies and interests you have outside of the podcast and startup space? What do you get into in your free time?
Again, for anyone that listened to the Gabby Leibovich interview, I think for the first half an hour of the podcast, we spoke about soccer and specifically Liverpool as well. I didn't know he was a huge Liverpool fan. What you don't know is that for the 30 minutes before that and the 30 minutes after the interview, we also spoke about Liverpool. So I'm obsessed with sports, specifically sort of cricket and soccer. I'm a huge Liverpool fan. I try and watch pretty much every episode live, including preseason games as well. Yeah, so weekends are generally a massive write-off for me, not because I'm going out and having a big night. I'm usually staying in and just watching the soccer until weird hours of the morning.
That is such an interesting thing to learn about someone, especially when you talk so much of startups. And I do remember that episode with Gabby, there was a lot of soccer talk. So you have to listen to that one if you're a soccer fan. Now, the next one I wanted to ask you was, what is the biggest insight that you've taken about investing from the show?
I don't know if it's specifically from the show, but, again, through just general conversations from people that I've had on the show, a lot of it is, especially for early stage investing, no one really knows. It's just so difficult to predict the future, and you can go through the due diligence process and all those sort of things, but you have no idea whether something like COVID will come in and help accelerate a business. You don't really know all of those things, but what it does come down to is the people, and what you're really backing and choosing to put your money behind and putting all of your conviction behind is the people that are in there in the business. And I think it's just been really interesting insight for me from the podcast, but also through kind of other mediums as well, is just to understand what does a caliber of, what does a world-class team actually look like, and what does that standard look like? And just being able to kind of unpack that a little bit with some of the investors on the show has been probably the biggest lesson that I've taken away from that, is just everything's on the people in the team and you sort of trusting them. So make sure that you're really sort of backing the right people, and that's all that really matters.
That's an awesome insight. Now, my next one is on the opposite side of that. What has been your favorite or your biggest insight that you've taken about being a founder of a startup?
Biggest insight. I mean, I shared this a little bit earlier in terms of hiring, but hiring is probably, as I mentioned, it's I try and tailor each episode to each guest, but one of the things that always comes up whenever I'm speaking to founders, especially at that particular stage, is just the challenge and the importance of hiring the right people. And just really how costly it is if you don't make the right decisions at that time. So if you rush through that process and don't hire the right people, you're not just losing, having to go through that process again. It's all of the time that you've lost. It's the amount of time that you've invested. It's the amount of time that it takes to make those decisions. And so really having a high bar for who you decide to bring in, which is very, very difficult when everything's on fire and you really need to fill particular spots as well. It's really, really tough. But yeah, just having those conversations and just really sort of seeing quite how costly it is if you make the wrong decisions has just been really eye-opening for me.
And you're right. Pretty much every guest at some point, whether investor side, startup side, has mentioned how important having a solid team is. And from what I've learned from listening to the show, a lot of investors are looking at what the team is that's behind the business before they'll even put any money behind it. So such a great insight. Now, to finish us off, because we have honestly just gone through so much stuff in this, and thank you so much to all the listeners for all your questions. It's been great to get an idea of what the listeners want to know and let me ask some of the questions I wanted to ask. But I'd love to finish off by asking, what are you most looking forward to with the future of the Startup Playbook podcast?
So as I mentioned, for me, this is really a 10-year journey as kind of from a macro view. So I'm only really halfway. So I'm really as you mentioned earlier, like, it's been such a fascinating journey. And I was chatting to a friend yesterday about this as well, like just thinking back to what life was like for me 5 years ago when I was first launching this compared to what it's like now, and just the meaningful impact that this podcast has made for me in a multitude of different ways has just been huge. And so I'm just excited to see what the next 5 years of this brings. And, on top of that, like there's so many things that I want to do with the show that, up until very recently, for the first 4.5 years, I was doing all of the editing and post-production and all of those sort of things, which, I think that everyone's been able to tell what a big difference, Tyler, having you on the show has made over the last couple of months as well. So I'm just excited to really start, doubling down on some of the things. Tyler and I have a couple of plans in terms of what we want to do, especially when it comes to things like content and repurposing things and just all things sort of social media. So I'm excited that, the podcast has just been very organic and in a way accidental in terms of the way that it's sort of grown up until now, without me really sort of thinking about it, putting a huge amount of time and energy towards some of these things. And so again, just very excited to see what happens when, I can add amazing people like Tyler onto the team that can, help lift up the podcast in a multitude of different ways. And, as I mentioned, like the podcast is sort of one piece of the puzzle in terms of what my sort of longer term view with a lot of those sort of things are. Again, Tyler and I have spoken about a couple of the things that we want to do with the podcast as a conduit for some of the other things as well. So watch this space, and hopefully we'll have some more sort of fun and exciting things. Hopefully it won't take another 5 years for some of those things to come to fruition, but just very excited about, where things are heading.
Yeah, me too. And thank you so much, Rohit, for those lovely, lovely words. It has been an absolute pleasure working with you for the last few months, and I'm looking forward to many more. And thank you for being so open with us today. I mean, it's really great to have you on the opposite side and answer some of the questions and get all of those great insights that we know have just been sitting up there bubbling in your brain as you interview all these incredible people. So thank you so much. This has been incredible, and I can't wait to see what the exciting future of the Startup Playbook podcast is going to bring.
Likewise. And once again, a reminder, Tyler, thanks for being such a great host for the podcast as well. For anyone that has enjoyed Tyler's hosting, highly recommend checking out her podcast as well. As for always, we'll make sure that we, add in all of the different episodes and things that we mentioned, including Tyler's podcast as well, into the show notes for this episode. Again, as Tyler mentioned, a big thank you to all of the previous podcast guests over the last 5 years for taking the time to sit down with me, very close to me for the first few months with that little tripod mic, and for everyone else that's kind of made time to come on the show. And honestly, like a huge thank you to everyone, obviously, who's submitted questions for the show, and for anyone who's taken the time to tune in and listen to the podcast as well. So many different types of content out there. It's just always been really meaningful for me to have people that have made the time to sort of listen to some of the conversations. Hopefully the podcast has helped you on your own journeys as well. But yeah, just personally wanted to say a big thank you to all of you for helping support the show. It's always meant a lot from all of you. So thank you.
And congratulations on 5 years, Rohit.
Thanks, Tyler.